My husband believed I was wasting my time on a harmless creative class, while he prepared to walk away with everything in our divorce. But when the courtroom fell silent, he discovered that my quiet nights had been spent building a future he could no longer touch. My name is Elena Moore. I am 32 years old. And on the day my marriage officially ended, my husband smiled as though the outcome had been decided long before we entered the courtroom. Before I tell you what happened when the judge reviewed the final financial disclosures, take a moment to let me know where you are listening from. Because this story has traveled farther than I ever expected, and it still surprises me how many people recognize parts of their own lives in it. The courtroom carried a sterile stillness that felt heavier than silence, filled with the soft rustle of documents and the faint hum of overhead lights, and the cold seemed to settle into my skin. As I sat with my hands folded tightly together, grounding myself in the present moment. Across from me sat Caleb, my husband of 10 years, leaning back in his chair with casual confidence, whispering to his attorney before releasing a quiet laugh that held no warmth, only certainty. I did not meet his eyes for long because I knew that expression too well, the subtle smirk of a man convinced he had already claimed victory. But I caught it anyway, and for a brief moment I felt the old instinct rise inside me, the urge to shrink, to smooth things over, to make myself easier to dismiss. Instead, I focused on the judge's bench and on breathing evenly. Because my attorney, Mr. Harrington, had told me earlier that composure was not weakness but control. And that silence could be sharper than any argument if it was chosen deliberately. Caleb's lawyer stood first and outlined their proposed settlement in a voice practiced to sound fair and reasonable, explaining numbers and conditions that implied generosity while quietly ensuring I would walk away with little more than a carefully measured transition plan. The message beneath the language was clear, that my role in the marriage had been supportive rather than substantial, temporary rather than integral. I remained still as he spoke, waiting for the moment to pass, waiting for the room to turn toward us. When he finally returned to his seat, Mr. Harrington stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and addressed the judge with calm precision, stating that we accepted the general terms with one important update, explaining that an amended and complete financial disclosure had been filed that morning on my behalf. A thick, bound document was placed on the table as a matching copy was delivered to Caleb's attorney, and I watched confusion flicker across my husband's face as he tried to understand what additional information could possibly exist. Because in his mind my identity had always been an extension of his own. As his attorney began turning pages with growing focus, my thoughts drifted backward to a much smaller space where everything had started, a rented garage that smelled of dust and oil, with a folding table, two mismatched chairs, and a whiteboard that barely fit against the wall. That whiteboard had been mine. Caleb was gifted with technical precision, endlessly focused on systems and code, but I had always been the one who saw how ideas translated into real use, how people interacted with what they were given, and how structure and story shaped success. I remembered the night he nearly walked away from everything, exhausted and convinced his work was too complex to survive, and how I stood in front of that whiteboard mapping out a clear path forward, explaining how his technology could serve real people through accessible design, practical pricing, and thoughtful positioning. He had looked at me with awe that night and called me brilliant, and I had believed that meant something lasting. But when the company grew and outside validation arrived, my contributions became invisible, my ideas absorbed and repeated without acknowledgement, while I told myself that shared success did not require shared credit. Over time, my role faded into the background until I was no longer part of the story at all, just the person who organized, supported, and sacrificed while Caleb's confidence expanded into every room he entered. At social gatherings, he spoke while I smiled, and when someone asked about my work, he answered for me, referring to my interests as harmless pastimes, meant to keep me occupied. The moment that finally shifted everything was quiet and devastating. Overhearing him dismiss my role entirely during a call with a potential investor, describing me as someone who handled minor details so he could focus on important decisions. Someone who was simply there. That night I did not argue or confront him. Instead, I made a choice that unfolded slowly but decisively to build something that belonged to me alone. I called Maya, My closest friend from design school who knew the version of me that existed before I became invisible, and when I told her what had happened, she did not offer comfort but clarity, asking whether I planned to remain unseen or finally claim the space I deserved. Within weeks, I had rented a small studio and began working quietly, using my savings and my skills to create something independent, something real. To Caleb, I said I had enrolled in a creative class, and he barely noticed, which gave me freedom he never intended to grant. For more than a year, I lived two lives. One as the accommodating spouse and another as a founder, learning through exhaustion and trial, building momentum slowly and deliberately. There were failures that nearly stopped me and victories that reminded me why I had started, including the moment a stranger purchased my work and the realization that something I created could stand on its own. Caleb noticed nothing, consumed by his own trajectory, until the truth surfaced all at once on a rainy afternoon when I walked into his office and discovered he had rewritten our marriage into a convenient lie, introducing me as a distant acquaintance rather than a wife. That moment clarified everything, and from there the path forward became direct, even when it was painful. I sought legal counsel, prepared carefully, and allowed his team to underestimate me completely. Back in the courtroom, I watched Caleb's attorney slow as he reached the unfamiliar sections of the document, his posture stiffening as he encountered growth statements, valuation reports, and finally a formal acquisition offer from an international fashion house. Written clearly in words, Caleb flipped through the pages with increasing panic, his confidence draining as reality settled in. And when he looked at me, his expression held not anger but disbelief. As though the world he understood had fractured without warning, the judge called a brief recess. And in the hallway, Caleb tried bargaining, reframing, pleading, and finally suggesting we reunite our success stories, revealing that he still viewed me as a resource rather than a person. I told him calmly that there was no shared future left to negotiate and walked away, understanding that closure does not require permission. The divorce concluded quietly, and in the months that followed, my life expanded in ways I had never allowed myself to imagine, culminating in a partnership that preserved my independence rather than consuming it. A year later, I read an article analyzing Caleb's professional failures, and instead of satisfaction, I felt distance because his story no longer belonged to me. What mattered was the work I continued to create and the knowledge that reclaiming myself had been the most difficult and meaningful work of my life. If you have listened this far, thank you for sharing this time with me. And if you have ever faced a moment that forced you to rediscover your own strength, I hope this reminds you that being underestimated can become the greatest advantage of all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more dramatic stories of betrayal, triumph, and empowerment.